back to my channel. So in this, the sixth of my episodes on the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, I wanted to talk today about the three particular individuals who were identified in different circumstances as being potentially linked to the bombings and also as being members of the British Army or former members of the British Army. I'm going to start with a very strange incident that took place on Portland Row in Dublin at the time. This was the fact that at around lunchtime on the 17th of May 1974, a civil servant in Aldborough House on Portland Row identified what appeared to be a suspicious vehicle, or what he thought looked like a suspicious vehicle. This was a white Bedford box van parked outside his place of work. And given the circumstances and the troubles and so forth, people had been on alert to report any suspicious vehicles and so forth. So he reported this unidentified van. He was able to take the registration number, but he reported this van, whose owner he was not known, to the police. Nothing initially was done, and therefore later at around 5:10 p.m. he again called because the van was still there. And this time, this is just before the bombs went off, this time the Gardaí did arrive, they did follow up, and by the time they had arrived, the van had gone. The driver had returned and driven it off, and the civil servant who reported the matter did actually manage to catch sight of the man and was able to give a description of sorts of him. But shortly after the car drove away, or the van, I should say, drove away, the bombs went off. So a fascinating coincidence, to say the least. Now, the civil servant later that evening was taken by the Gardaí down to the B&I, that's British and Irish, ferry port. This is because they suspected that the van may have been driven there with a view to taking the ferry. Initially they weren't able to find it, but then they were able to locate the van in the deep sea area of the B&I ferry port. And they searched the van, the Gardaí searched the vehicle, and what did they find? Only a British Army uniform. Well, isn't that the fascinating coincidence? They found a British Army uniform, and as noted in Mr. Justice Henry Barron's report, they found a British Army officer on board, according to Irish military intelligence, and he was taken off the ship. Now, there are a number of issues here, because the way it's phrased in the Barron report makes it sound as though only one British officer was concerned, i.e. they found this man's uniform and then they subsequently found him on the ferry and took him off. But that's actually not the case. What happened was that they found the first British Army officer, and then according to Irish military intelligence, there was a second officer who was taken off the B&I ferry port. So a remarkable coincidence that there was not one but two of them. I wonder, did they know each other? Anyway, we are not aware, or the Irish people are not allowed to know, what excuse there was, if any, for this extraordinary coincidence. So, Patrick McEntee, the barrister, was asked to do a report on the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. He did a commission of investigation, and this is one of the areas that he was asked to look into. And this threw further light on what had initially been uncovered. Like, the commission of investigation is looking at it some 30 years later. So a huge amount of evidence would have been lost or missing, and people would not be able to remember. But still, considering this was the most serious crime in the history of the state, Ireland's 9/11, and considering that it would have been the most memorable day in the career of any Garda officer who was involved in investigating the crime, it seems remarkable the extent to which some of the Gardaí are unable to remember what they were doing on that day. Truly fascinating, as we will now see. So despite the lapse of time, the McEntee Commission was actually able to interview the same witness, this civil servant who had been working on Portland Row and who had seen the suspicious van. The McEntee Commission was able to track down and meet with this person and take evidence from him. Remarkably, the man described how he had seen the driver come round the corner from Amiens Street. So from Amiens Street to Portland Row means that he was coming from the exact same direction that he would have been coming had he planted the bombs in either Talbot Street or Parnell Street. So we now have someone who is not only leaving, attempting to flee the country shortly after the bombs went off, but moreover, someone who has actually come from the direction of the bombs, has driven away in a van. The bombs have almost immediately afterwards gone off, and he is then seeking to get out of the country and is a British Army officer, a member of the army, suspected of having planned the bombs. Well, if that's not a remarkable coincidence we're being asked to believe, I don't know what is. I mean, So the driver was able to describe how the man had told Gardaí that the man was a captain in the Territorial Army in Britain. The name was not revealed in either of the reports that are on the public record, but this man was actually confirmed by name, so that's significant corroboration. The name was there, the name was followed up, and supposedly it was confirmed that he was there for business reasons. Now, the McEntee Commission report says, page 125, quote, "The Commission does not know what aspects, if any, of the van driver's account may have been verified or by what means. Commission does not know what aspects, if any, of the van..." Significant corroboration. The name was there, the name was followed up, and supposedly it was confirmed that he was there for business reasons. Now, the McEntee Commission report says, page 125, quote, "The Commission does not know what aspects, if any, of the van driver's account may have been verified or by what means. Commission does not know what aspects, if any, of the van driver's account may have been verified or by what means." So, why should we believe this man when he says he was on business? He was in Dublin on business reasons, for private business reasons. How would he have had time for any significant business dealings if he was a captain in the Territorial Army? Would that not have been rather time-consuming? And there's also the fact that this was Ireland in the mid-1970s. This would have been a fairly hostile environment for a person who was a captain in Britain's Territorial Army. It wouldn't have been a natural place where you would be transacting innocent business. So, if not impossible, there are certainly serious question marks over the plausibility as to why this captain in the Territorial Army was in Dublin and what excuse he had for being in the immediate vicinity of the bombs and driving away just after the bombs went off. It seems extremely suspicious. But this person was never extradited to face any prosecution, and it does not even appear that this person was ever arrested to be interviewed. Now, returning to the issue of Gardaí's memory, according to Mr. McEntee's report, both the sergeant who wrote the report and the inspector to whom it was addressed, this is the report of the incident, claimed not to remember the incident. Now, I don't know about you, but as far as I'm concerned, if you believe that, you believe anything. Are we seriously asked to believe that members of a police force, the purpose of which is obviously to investigate crime, would not remember, even after the lapse of many years, would not have no recollection of having seen someone seeking to flee the country on the evening that the person was suspected of having carried out a massive bombing in the middle of the country's capital city? I don't find that remotely plausible. The only question is, if they are lying, as seems likely, why were they lying? Were they lying because it brought back unfortunate memories? Were they lying to cover for someone? Who knows? So returning to the issue of the other soldier, because as I explained, there were two soldiers rather than one, based on the different accounts. Returning to the other soldier, this was a separate incident, and according to Irish military intelligence, rather than the Gardaí, this other soldier had been taken off the ferry. Now, Mr. Paddy McEntee looked into this issue. To be fair to Mr. McEntee, he does seem to be someone who was very thorough, and he was a very respected criminal barrister. So I'm sure he would have done a thorough investigation, but his conclusion was remarkable. He didn't find any material confirming the incident. That wasn't remarkable. But he said, and I quote, this is page 134 in his report, the fact that sorry, I'm not actually starting the quote immediately, but the fact that the Commission couldn't find material confirming the incident, quote, strongly suggests that the incident described in the Army intelligence document did not take place, unquote. Now that is a truly remarkable thing to say. In other words, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Any criminal lawyer would know that that's not the case. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He is saying that because he's been unable to corroborate the account given by Irish military intelligence, not that this may mean that it didn't take place, but that it strongly indicates that it did not take place. This is simply a conclusion that is in no way supported by the facts. There is Mr. McEntee suggesting that Irish military intelligence completely made up this incident for no reason? It's hard to see why they would have made something up like this. This is a specific incident at the time of an extremely serious event to take place in the history of the state. Mr. McEntee makes the point in his report that no passengers on the ship or people on the crew seemed to remember a person being taken off the boat. Well, presumably the Irish military intelligence would have had a little bit more sophistication than to tell everyone that they were taking a person off the boat because they were an undeclared member of the British military. I'm assuming that Irish Army intelligence would have had a little bit more sophistication than that. I mean, there are any number of ways in which they could have devised an excuse or a pretext by seeking to say, we just want to check your, we just want to have a chat, we just have a business proposition we would like to discuss with you. That's always a good one. Or whatever excuse you choose to name, taken him aside and explained, we know who you are, we want you to follow us, otherwise X, Y, Z. And for various reasons he may have agreed to without a struggle. The idea that the crew wouldn't have been aware of him being taken off the ferry is not remotely probative as proving that this incident did not take place. This is the most serious crime to take place in the history of our country. This is something that should not lightly be dismissed, a contemporaneous report from Irish military intelligence. The third, and perhaps most curious of the reported sightings of British military intelligence officers was that not of a serving officer, but of a corporal or an ex-corporal in the British Army. The circumstances of this came about through an anonymous source. This anonymous source recognized a person who had been a soldier in the British Army. The anonymous source was an ex-soldier, and the corporal was also an ex-soldier at the time of the alleged sighting. Recognized him in Dublin before the bombs. The soldier had trained I suppose let's call him the reporting ex-soldier. The reporting ex-soldier claimed to have trained with this man whom he cited, trained with him in Wrexham in Wales in the year 1960. So it would have been a reasonable number of years, but I mean, after 14 years, a person isn't going to change so much that you can't recognize them normally. They would still have been recognizable, particularly if you would have been in close quarters, as I'm sure you would have been when you're engaged in military training. So the reporting ex-soldier saw him in a car. So there were two sightings. First, he saw him in a car on College Green in Dublin, immediately recognized him, and this incident was 2 days before the Dublin bombings, the first Dublin bombings, because before the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, there were bombings in December of 1972. These took place in Liberty Hall and Sackville Street. There were bombs that went off. They had lower casualties were suffered than in the Dublin Monaghan bombs, but they were still serious. And this ex-corporal in the British Army was cited 2 days before this took place. Then on the 15th of May 1974, again 2 days before the 17th of May bombings, the reporting soldier reported again that he had seen this ex-corporal. This time he saw him in a car on Lower O'Connell Street. The reporting ex-officer was able to give quite a detailed description of the specifics of how he looked. For example, a square jawline with a prominent cleft under the front of his chin, darkish brown hair V-shaped at the front of his forehead, and short side locks. So it is a fairly detailed description. I've actually just quoted extracts from the description. It is fairly detailed, and there's no obvious reason why a person would be making this up. Now, the Gardaí did, in fairness, take this somewhat seriously, sufficiently serious that they wrote to the British authorities asking for details about this person. This is where it gets particularly interesting, because the British authorities replied neither confirming nor denying that this person existed, and neither confirming nor denying that they had records of this ex-corporal. Well, they denied to a certain extent, but it was a denial that was phrased very carefully. In their carefully worded statement, they said that how colleagues had been unable to assist, or words to that effect, or how the inquiries had been fruitless. So note how carefully worded that is. If you say someone has been unable to assist, that could be interpreted, the natural interpretation, if there's a bona fide investigation, is they're unable to assist because they don't have any documentation and because no one has heard of this person. But of course, unable to assist could mean that they're unable to assist because it's sensitive, or they're unable to assist because they are not minded to assist, or any number of reasons, or because they've been instructed not to assist. So Mr. Justice Barron in his report was dissatisfied with what he viewed, and I agree, was a very unconvincing reply from the UK authorities. Mr. Justice Barron felt that he should have followed up, that the Irish authorities should have followed up about this alleged British soldier. And I think he was completely correct in that. As regards the McEntee report, this was again one of the areas that Paddy McEntee was asked to look at in his own investigation. This is where it gets fascinating, because Mr. McEntee, through very diligent research, was able to find documentation in terms of magazines and so forth from the army that indeed corroborated the existence of this person as having trained in the Wrexham base in Wales. This strongly supports and corroborates the account that the anonymous source had given. Of course, we have to be very careful with anonymous sources. People may be anonymous sources because what they're saying is complete lies, and they don't want to be exposed as liars. But people may also be anonymous sources because they have a very legitimate fear for their safety. And the fact that this anonymous source was stacked up and corroborated after a period of some 30 years strongly lends credence to this source as being truthful. The source's name was, we have no idea what the name was, but apparently it wasn't a particularly common surname. And therefore, the investigator, Paddy McEntee, was able to say, look, there are only so many people this could have been. He was able to narrow it down. When he had followed up with the British authorities, they had stuck to their original position when they had been contacted by stating that, oh, we don't keep records in this format, we're unable to search and so forth. But Mr. McEntee exposed this as having just been blustering and dishonest, because he was able to prove that this person existed, and furthermore, the person was still alive, even in 2006. So, 2006, the person was described as being about 30 in 1960, so he would have been 76 or thereabouts at the time that Mr. McEntee met him. But anyway, he succeeded in meeting him and spoke and got his account. Now, the Commission of Investigation was not a court of law, so this would not have had the status of sworn evidence, but he was nonetheless able to get this man's account and ask him, and strangely, Mr. McEntee seemed to be satisfied with his account, that he had been in Dublin possibly for some other reason, that I think he had wanted to see some sporting matches or something. I don't find this credible in the circumstances and in light of the other evidence we've seen. If there was such an innocent explanation, it seems surprising that the British authorities weren't happy to produce this man at the time, and it seems surprising that the British authorities would have obstructed the investigation and tracking down of this man. A more likely outcome, or a more likely explanation in my view, is that this man was indeed involved in planning the bombings on the part of the British state, and he was given a script to say to Mr. McEntee that he was doing something else. It seems highly unlikely that he had an innocent explanation. He doesn't furthermore seem to have been able to account for his movements on the material times when he was alleged to have been in Dublin. He seems to have denied that he was in Dublin at that exact time, but he hasn't given an alternative account. Obviously, when you're talking about a period of 30 years, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But in the circumstances, it does add to the weight of evidence against him. We have no idea who this person is. It would be a fascinating thing for someone who had the resources and time to do so, to look up who might have been in Wrexham base, who met that description at that time, whether there's any public documentation that might support it, but that person unfortunately isn't going to be me. So we have 3 people who were in the British Army, or had been in the British Army, and there are credible accounts, not necessarily true, not proven beyond doubt, but credible accounts that there were 3 soldiers or ex-soldiers acting very suspiciously in Dublin at the time the 3 bombs went off. That brings us to an end of this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in.